Instead of the traditional tier list, today we're going to try something a bit different. So we're looking at healers in Dragonflight in the beta at the moment. But let's clear up a few things before I get started. First of all, we're in the middle of tuning at the moment, and I expect that at least 2 of the specs on this list are going to receive non-tuning iteration changes in the coming weeks. Coincidentally, I think those 2 specs at the moment, as I'm going to rate them, are the best healer so far for me and the worst. So that'll be interesting. And second, this is not about power. I am ranking specs based more on how polished I believe they feel like, right? Like the back of the horse, the well-drawn part of the horse. The specs that feel like well fleshed out, well iterated upon specs that don't have any overarching issues. And then as we progress towards the more rudimentary specs over towards the head of the horse, it's going to be the specs that have their strengths and weaknesses right now. And particularly the ones that I'm wary of the weaknesses, that I don't, the specs with issues that I don't think a simple tuning pass is going to fix. And lastly, I will say that the difference between the best and the worst is not that much. I'm not talking about like completely OP busted specs on one end and then completely trash tier non-viable specs on the other. I think all healers are going to be viable in pretty much all content other than maybe Mythic Plus at the moment. A couple of them will struggle with. And I don't see how preservation really functions in PvP at all. I'm not the world's best PvPer, so I could be wrong. Just seems like it's very weak in that department at the moment. But again, tuning could change all of this, so who knows? I have videos for more detailed reviews of all the healers, so I'll link them in the description below if you're interested. And first of all, I guess, will be a little bit of a disappointment to some people, I think, but I think preservation is probably going to be like the worst healer that I'm going to put on this list, and probably somewhere around here. We're going to go with this half well-drawn leg. It's not quite stick figure leg, but it isn't well developed and articulated and well fleshed out and iterated upon. Now, I think preservation is actually quite a fun playstyle. You effectively juggle casting empowered spells, using essence spending abilities, and spamming a filler spell between them. And then sprinkled through that, there's a couple of cooldowns, short-term cooldowns. And I think that overall playstyle is actually quite fun. And my opinion on preservation has changed a lot with the Mythic Plus testing weekend. In Heroics, it was actually really quite fun, and I didn't have that many criticisms of the spec. But in Mythic Plus, a few issues have become apparent. First, and okay, it's not even the range issue that most people point to. I think the 30-yard range is fine. My issue is that mobility is very low. Hover just isn't that good. Doesn't work with empowered casts. Can't press it while casting to move like you can with shamans. The abilities that are meant to be strong saves or spot healing, like Fly With Me or Verdant Embrace or whatever, can get you killed more often than not once incoming damage becomes dangerous. Right? Once failing mechanics checks or whatever gets you killed, then flying to someone who's taking a lot of damage usually means that you're going to take a lot of damage. So that's one issue with the spec. The other one is that defensives are extremely weak, almost non-existent. The weakest of any healer, and it isn't close. But it is a strong stacked AoE healer, particularly burst healing. Its damage is quite good, and its healing cooldowns are excellent. Next up, we'll go with Discipline Priest. I'm going to go from effectively worst to best. Discipline Priest and Holy Priests would, in my opinion, be actually quite close. They're probably going to be more like here, maybe. The difference between something like Discipline and what's going to be in the S tier would only be 1 or 2 kind of issues. It's not a huge deal. At the moment, I think those issues are that Discipline is it feels quite imbalanced at the moment. I think the removal of Shadow Mend has been terrible. I think Disc would have been in my S tier if Shadow Mend stayed and Shadow Covenant was made into a viable triage healing cooldown. I would have been pretty much happy with the whole spec. Maybe getting Mindseer back to do damage would have been great, but that's pretty minor. Overall, the issues is that while Atonement healing is significantly stronger in Dragonflight compared to Shadowlands, your triage healing or spot healing or direct healing, Atonement applicators, whatever you want to call it, that element of the spec is much weaker than it was, in my opinion, in Shadowlands. The question mark about that at the moment is that Power Word Shield is doing your heavy lifting for triage healing at the moment, and it is extremely strong, like critting for 100% of someone's health bar as a power word shield. Probably not healthy for the game. It's probably not going to stay that way. I imagine it's going to get nerfed at some point prior to launch, and that will really be when I think this is going to need some more work. Power word shield, power word life, it's just not strong enough. And my other, I guess, minor criticism of Disc is that it has become a bit of a two-button spec. Pretty much press power word shield and penance on cooldown, and everything else you do doesn't matter anywhere near as much as those things. Like I said before, losing Mindseer kind of sucks a little bit. Not in a like power way, just because I liked being able to deal damage from range with Mindseer without having to spam Holy Nova. Now, all of that being said, having Schism, Mind Games, Light's Wrath if you want it, Juiced Penance from Harsh Discipline, and Purge the Wicked spread, and all that kind of stuff makes Atonement throughput much higher, and it feels good. But like I said, it's just the triage aspect of Discipline that's lacking. Discipline is probably still going to be insane in raid, like S tier raid. It's crazy. Holy Priest. I'm going to put Holy Priest with Disc, and that's mostly because Holy Priest to me feels a little node starved. It feels like I don't have enough points to take all of the things I want to take. And I think part of that goes back to Holy at the moment feels like a bit of a weak baseline spec, and then you have to pick talents to make certain aspects of your toolkit viable, right? Like your single target or spot healing or whatever. It just isn't really viable without Light Weaver. Same goes with your AoE healing. It just isn't really viable without Circle of Healing and Prayer of Healing. And then you also really want the Prayer of Mending nodes because that makes your kind of like sustained spread healing good. And then you also want your cooldowns like Divine Hymn or Apotheosis or Salvation, or you want your extra Holy Word cooldowns and stuff like that, and there just aren't enough points to get all of those things. If you want strong spot healing and AoE healing, you probably don't have the points to get damage or strong cooldowns. If you want strong cooldowns and good spot healing and damage, you have no AoE healing. If you want AoE healing and raid cooldowns and stuff, you don't have the points to get the other things, if that makes sense. It's just, it feels like a little bit butter spread over too much bread. It is definitely weaker in Dragonflight than it is in Shadowlands, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing because Shadowlands Holy is kind of jacked. Holy Paladin. Holy Paladin is going to go just ahead of those two pre-specs. Holy Paladin at the moment suffers a little bit from Blizzard trying to cram effectively two different playstyles or specs into one tree, and that is the melee Holy Paladin build and the caster Holy Paladin build. Now, the reason why it's still going to be A tier is because the melee Holy Paladin builds or playstyle is still there. It's still extremely strong. It plays well. It feels good. It's great. The only downside I really have for the melee Holy Paladin build at the moment is that it's melee, and spending a weekend in Mythic Plus with Thundering wasn't fun on Mistweaver or Holy Paladin just because they're melee. I think the toolkit of Holy Paladin is quite good. Its utility is good. Things like having Blessing of Summer now, the Glimmer buff has been nice. Getting a battle res and stuff, it's all good. It all makes the spec feel good and better than it was in Shadowlands. But the class tree is a little underwhelming, and the spec tree is a little lacking compared to other healers, because if you're playing a melee Holy Paladin, instead of having your spec tree be mostly different options, think about Holy Paladin as just like you don't have half of those options because they're made for a different playstyle that you aren't utilizing. Overall, I'd still say the spec is quite good, but it feels a little divisive at the moment. Up next, we have what I would say are the big three winners of Dragonflight. And first of all, I guess we'll go with Resto Shaman. And we'll put Resto Shaman IA, actually no, Resto Shaman probably S tier. So Resto Shaman's one of those specs. First of all, I think Blizzard got the class tree right with Resto Shaman. Like straight off the bat, probably the best class tree of any spec or any class in the game. It has no real throughput nodes other than like one or two, like a capstone. But it's like a build your own utility with many options to pick from. And that feels great. I can see Resto Shamans having different spec loadouts and class trees for different dungeons because their utility is that good and that specific, and they have so many options that they can't take it all at the same time. But there are going to be some dungeons where some things are excellent and others aren't, and they'll be able to pick and choose around that, and that's going to be fantastic for them. I also think Resto Shaman is definitely the sleeper spec. It didn't look like it got many changes, but I think the small changes it did get have been very impactful. The main one being Chain Heal being added to the Tidal Waves buff just feels great. Chain Heal is a really good button to press now, and also being able to take a lot of talents that used to be mutually exclusive for Shaman feels really strong. The other one is Acid Rain talent. I like the fact that Resto Shaman now has more buttons to press, especially in Mythic Plus. It doesn't feel like you're just spamming Riptide Healing Surge like I would have said or criticized Resto Shaman as being in Shadowlands. Now you have Chain Heal as honestly good, powerful throughput options for AoE healing. You have all the Riptide nodes, which are obviously your bread and butter, which all feel good. You also get your Acid Rain, so you can, drop your Healing Rain down. There's just more buttons to press. And then on top of all of that, you have excellent utility. You get Lightning Lasso if you want it. You get Stormkeeper if you want it. It's overall just a really, really fun spec. And it feels like the whole spec tree, class tree, everything synergizes together well. And it feels powerful. And the main reason why it's in S tier with the last two healers is because it really doesn't have any overarching issues. I don't have any real complaints for Resto Shaman. I mean, getting Gust of Wind back, S tier. Mistweaver, also S tier. The Phalanx Stomp nodes might be the best 4 points on any healer's spectre in the whole of Dragonflight. They're just that good. They're crazy strong, they're fun, it's a feel-good playstyle, especially in dungeons. It might be a little bit lacking in raid or on single targets and bosses and things because the throughput is conditional on hitting multiple targets. But yeah, seeing health bars move when my screen fills up with damage numbers is just really fun. So your utility is also quite good. The physical damage taken debuff, Ring of Peace, Leg Sweep, Paralysis, Revival for the debuff removal. It feels good, honestly. The class tree capstones are a little bit underwhelming if I had to level criticism somewhere. But overall, it feels like a really good spec. Being able to spread your Renewing Mists everywhere, getting Enveloping Mist procs on your Renewing Mists, doing crazy damage in dungeons. It all feels great. The only issue I could see is the same one as Holy Paladin, is just being in melee sucks at the moment. Now I imagine Thundering is going to get some iteration and it won't hopefully be as punishing for melee, but regardless, the spec itself is fantastic. And the last one is Resto Druid. Now, Resto Druid is also S tier. I would actually put it like a little bit ahead of those other two S tier specs. Resto Druid at the moment feels a little bit like S plus to me. It has no real issues. And Resto Druid is the other class, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, that I think will get some kind of iteration on its class tree specifically, because it is the only class tree left in the game that still has 3-point nodes. I imagine that's going to get changed before launch. But other than that, it really isn't lacking in any way. Its utility is great, its mana longevity is great, its throughput is great, its options and its build options and talent synergies are through the roof. There are multiple different play styles. My only real minor criticism from Resto Druid in BFA, I guess, and Shadowlands would have been that it felt like you pressed a lot of buttons to not do much healing, and then as soon as you really had to heal, you just spammed regrowth. And I would say that the best change, in my opinion, for Resto Druids, at least from that kind of playstyle perspective in Dragonflight, is that it feels like that is no longer the case. Invigorate is fantastic and really powerful. Being able to take the Swiftman buff and the Swiftman hot and Invigorate and things like Verdancy is just a ton of throughput, and throughput that isn't reliant on regrowth. I imagine Resto Druids are going to be crazy good in raids, crazy good in PvP, crazy good in Mythic Plus. They feel really fun. Like I said, the synergy is through the roof. The talent options and build variations are fantastic. If the class tree gets looked at, Resto Druid is the king of healers for me at the moment. I forgot to say that the second spec that I think will get some kind of revision, non-tuning iteration, is going to be Preservation. And that is for the simple reason that it's a brand new spec that Blizzard is adding to the game, and at the moment it feels lacking. And I imagine that they aren't going to let one of the flagship aspects of a new expansion ship in a less than ideal state. So I imagine it'll get some love in the next couple of weeks. But yeah, tell me what you think, or how I'm wrong, or what I've missed, and algorithm stuff. But thanks.